We call it the wilderness. But long before that word became a symbol of American identity, before it justified expansion and conquest, before it was painted into the national imagination, it was something else entirely. It was home, managed, cultivated, and thriving. And the lie that it was empty, that North America was a vast, untouched wilderness waiting to be tamed, is not just a historical error. It is the foundation myth that allowed an entire continent to be claimed and an entire reality to be erased. This is the story of that lie and why it still matters. Most people believe that when European settlers arrived in North America, they found a pristine wilderness, endless forests, untouched prairies, a land barely marked by human presence. And that belief makes sense. Early colonial writings describe the continent as vast, wild, abundant. The forests seemed ancient. The land seemed untouched. And so the narrative took hold that indigenous peoples lived lightly on the land, that they were too few, too nomadic, too primitive to have shaped it in any meaningful way. But that narrative was not observation. It was interpretation, and it was shaped by what settlers needed to believe, that the land was empty, available, theirs for the taking. Because if the land was not empty, if it was already managed, already home to millions, then claiming it became something much harder to justify. The year is 1491, 1 year before everything changes. The place, the Eastern Woodlands, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, covering what will one day be called New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the South. The air smells of wood smoke and earth. The forest is open, tall trees with clear ground beneath them, no dense thicket of undergrowth. Sunlight filters through the canopy, dappling the ground where berries grow in abundance. You can see for long distances. You can walk easily. And if you look closely, you will notice patterns. Groves of nut trees, chestnuts, walnuts, planted generations ago, now mature and productive. Clearings where deer graze, maintained by controlled burns, fields of corn, beans, and squash stretching along river valleys. This is not wilderness. This is a managed landscape, and it has been this way for thousands of years. The population of North America before European contact is estimated at somewhere between 5 and 15 million people. Not scattered bands struggling to survive, but complex societies with cities, trade networks, governance systems, and agricultural practices sophisticated enough to sustain large populations. The forests were not untouched. They were shaped. The prairies were not natural. They were maintained with fire. The abundant settlers encountered was not accidental. It was the result of millennia of careful stewardship. Imagine a man in his 50s, a member of a Wampanoag community in what is now Massachusetts, preparing to set a controlled burn in late autumn. He has done this his entire life, as his father did, as his grandfather did. The timing must be precise. After the leaves have fallen, before the first snow, when the ground is damp enough that the fire will stay low. He moves through the forest with a torch, lighting small fires in careful patterns. The flames spread slowly, consuming dry underbrush, clearing invasive saplings, enriching the soil with ash. By evening, the smoke is cleared. The forest floor is black, but within weeks, new growth will emerge. Grasses, berries, the plants that deer feed on. This is not destruction. This is cultivation, and it has been practiced here for longer than anyone can remember. He does not know that within a generation, disease will devastate his community, that settlers will arrive and see these open forests and assume they have always been this way, that they will call it wilderness and claim it as if it were unclaimed. The wilderness was not found. It was created by the absence of the people who had shaped it. When European diseases swept through indigenous populations in the 1500s and 1600s, killing up to 90% in some regions, the land did not stay the same. Without controlled burns, forests grew thick. Without cultivation, fields returned to scrub. Without management, the abundance that had sustained millions began to shift. And when English settlers arrived in the early 1600s, they encountered a landscape in transition. A landscape that, just decades before, had been densely populated and carefully tended. But now, in the aftermath of catastrophe, it looked empty. And they interpreted that emptiness as its natural state. This was not malice. At first, it was misunderstanding. But misunderstanding became law. The doctrine of discovery, a legal principle rooted in European colonialism, claimed that land occupied by non-Christians, land not being used in ways Europeans recognized, was legally available for claiming. And because settlers did not recognize indigenous land management as management, they declared the continent vacant, a wilderness, empty, theirs. Here is the lie: that North America was a wilderness before European arrival. And here's the truth. It was a managed, cultivated, inhabited landscape shaped by millions of people over thousands of years. The forests were open because they were burned. The fields were fertile because they were tended. The abundance was not natural. It was created. And when the people who maintained that landscape were displaced, when their management systems were interrupted, the land began to change into something it had not been for millennia. The wilderness settlers believed they were conquering was not the original state of the continent. It was the aftermath of collapse. And that distinction matters, because the myth of wilderness justified everything that followed. The claiming of land, the displacement of peoples, the rewriting of history. If the land was empty, there was nothing to take. If it was wild, there was no one to harm. If it was unused, then putting it to proper use was not theft. It was progress. But the land was never empty, and the people who lived here were never absent. This was not the beginning of America. It was the interruption of something older. The managed forests, the cultivated fields, the trade routes and cities. These were not primitive. They were the result of accumulated knowledge, refined over millennia, adapted to the specific conditions of this continent. And when that knowledge was dismissed, when it was erased from the narrative, we lost more than history. We lost a way of understanding the land itself, one that saw it not as a resource to be exploited, but as a relationship to be maintained. Today, scientists are rediscovering what indigenous peoples never forgot: that the forests were healthier when they were burned, that ecosystems thrive under careful management, that the wilderness we now protect in national parks is not returning to its natural state, because its natural state included people. And across North America, indigenous communities are reclaiming their role as stewards, reintroducing controlled burns, restoring traditional agricultural practices, reminding the world that the land was never wild. It was always home. We call it the wilderness, but now you know it was never that. It was a managed landscape, shaped by millions, sustained for thousands of years, until a lie replaced the truth and absence was mistaken for emptiness. And the biggest lie about early America is that it was empty. Because if it was never empty, then everything we thought we knew about how this nation began has to be reconsidered. If this changed how you see the land around you, if you realize that wilderness is not the absence of people, but the interruption of their presence, then this is only the beginning. Subscribe to Before America, where the story starts before the maps, and the past is never as simple as we were taught.